In her address during the release of the 2024 National Senior Certificate results, Basic Education Minister Siviwe Gwarube noted the growing discrepancy in performances between boy and girl learners. Girls have been consistently increasing the performance gap compared to boys, an observance that has raised concern.
It is also important to note that girl learners performed better than boy learners in obtaining bachelor passes. This performance trend is also visible in other parts of the schooling system, with boy learners staying longer in the system than girl learners. While we are succeeding in reducing the historical challenge faced by the girl child in obtaining an education, our interventions do need to be strengthened and broadened so that we do not leave the boy child behind.
Right, let's bring in some reaction. We're joined by Stellenbosch University researcher Gabrielle Wills. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. I mean, interesting observation here. If girls are increasingly pulling ahead, what does it mean for the education system? Is it failing boys? How should we interpret this outcome?
I think we really have to think about where these gaps and this pro-girl gender gap is coming from. We know that it's been an increasing issue emerging over time. You don't just see that in the change in the matric results, but we see this in earlier grades, in the foundation phase, where we've increasingly seeing that girls are ahead over boys in both reading and mathematics at the grade 4 level and grade 5 level as well.
Yeah, because
and it's really. And it's really about coming back to and seeing where's the source of where this is emerging and trying to identify why. What is the reason for this? I think it's very important for us to interrogate this issue in the context of South Africa.
Because, yeah, as you mentioned, while the pro-gender gap may be news to many South Africans, it's not something that has been of primary concern to the Basic Education Department. I understand it has preoccupied education researchers for years. What are some of the findings as we look to some of the solutions as we try and find a way forward here? Because, you know, it's one thing to acknowledge it, but what happens next?
I think we first need to understand why it's happening. And this, we know that it's there. We know that girls are ahead. And it starts as early as, we can see it in grade 4 test scores, we can see it in grade 3 test scores, and we can even see it at an early childhood development level. For example, in South Africa's a rollout of the Thrive by 5 study, children that are aged 4 to 5, we find that girls are ahead. They are more likely to thrive by 5 than boys, even at the age of 4 or 5. And it's an interesting question. We also see some of these gaps, gender gaps, being worse in poorer contexts. So there's more of an advantage to girls in poorer contexts. But what is really crucial and missing from the whole story is unpacking why. We can explain about 50% of that gap, at the pro-girl gap. Some of it's accounted for in schooling by different repetition patterns across boys and girls. There are also differences in socio-emotional skills across boys and girls. And typically girls show slightly higher social-emotional preparedness or readiness for school, even at a very young age. But this is not sufficient. It only explains about 50% of these differences, or get this gender gap that we are observing in foundation phase.
So what does it show? Should the country now be shifting its gender equity focus to the emerging boy crisis in the education system to ensure that boys are not left behind? I mean, the minister, just before you and I spoke, said boys learners are staying much longer in the system.
I think one has to be very cautious about taking a gender-specific approach in education. I think we want all children to reach their potential, and all children deserve to be supported and along in the journey that they are at. And I think when you start getting into gender programming, it can be quite complex. In some international contexts, for example, where there's a girl disadvantage, when education systems have tried to tackle that through gender-specific programming, that sometimes hasn't worked. And some of the reason for this is that the gender gap is not necessarily an education issue. It might really stem from broader failure of government development. It might relate to family factors and societal factors. And so one has to, when we're thinking about how to address the problem, we need to know where it's coming from. And that right now to researchers and to the research community is actually not clear enough. And this we need to unpack more. So I think we need to be very careful about saying, well, let's address this problem by having some gender-based programming in education. I think what we want to be doing is ensuring that we are addressing backlogs for all children, typically at a younger age in the foundation phase that is typically likely to be boys who are behind. Nevertheless, there are girls that are also behind.
Yes.
And so we need to be very careful and cognizant of this. And I think what's really key to the issue is identifying where children are struggling, whether it's boys or girls, and remediating effectively into those areas of weakness, which requires good assessment from early grades to identify key foundational weaknesses, whether it's in reading or mathematics, and identifying where those children are struggling and really targeting interventions where there's weaknesses. And that might be for girls, it might be for boys, it might be for more boys because of what we see in the stats. But it doesn't change the approach, in my opinion. But as I said, I think what's also fundamental to the issue, first of all, is really having more research, and particularly qualitative research, to try and unpack you in more detail, as well as we need longitudinal data that tracks children from a very young age, even from birth through to schooling, and seeing where, at what point, and why. What factors? Is it household factors? Has it got to do with family formation, the societal factors, the presence of mothers or fathers, or lack of fathers in a home? We don't really understand these things, and we need to get it. We need to understand it better before we start thinking about gender-specific programming.
What about the child not being able to resonate with the teaching style, the format of the current system in the schools under the Basic Education Department? I mean, how does that factor in? Or also looking at aspects like ADHD and dyslexia and things like that?
I think there are many people that would say that schooling is it rewards certain skills that girls tend to demonstrate more. So, self-management, self-control, consciousness, attitudes towards reading, for example, being able to sit and concentrate. Girls might demonstrate more of those behaviors, and schooling system kind of requires, success in the schooling system requires that you have some of those things. And so, for example, we find that differences in factors like confidence in mathematics, attentiveness, and other factors related to that do explain some of the gender gap. Certainly not all of it, but some of it. So that does kind of suggest that schooling as a system might be more suited to girls than boys. Nevertheless, I think this requires more engagement, more classroom observation by researchers to really see, if you were to tweak certain teaching strategies, it'd be the case that some would engage boys more than something else. And we really need to be exploring these ideas a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for weighing in on this very important discussion. Stellenbosch University researcher Gabrielle Wills giving us a sense of some of the options when it comes to the gender matter in the education system.